Good morning. It's a great pleasure to introduce my friend and colleague, David Magellan Horth, who's a senior fellow and senior designer at the Center for Creative Leadership, CCL, in Greensboro, North Carolina. The CCL is a top-ranked nonprofit organization that develops better leaders through leadership, education, and research. Founded in 1970, CCL helps clients around the world cultivate creative leadership, the capacity to achieve more than imagined by thinking and acting beyond. David joined the center in 1990, and he currently serves as a program designer, facilitator, and author. He's a co-author of a chapter in the prestigious The Change Handbook and co-author of The Leader's Edge, 6 Creative Competencies for Navigating Complex Challenges, a fantastic book, by the way, which received an award from the Banff Center for the Arts for its contribution to the connection between arts and business leadership. This book was based on the research surrounding the program Leading Creatively, designed by David, which used the arts and art making as a forum for developing creative leaders. An accomplished trainer in a range of custom and open enrollment programs, open-minded too, I would say, yeah. At the CCL, David is fluent in both the technical and administrative aspects of business. David presents at major executive events, international conferences. He describes himself as an artist in training. He enjoys drawing, writing poetry, and his special gift is music. He plays a variety of instruments, ranging from African drums to piano and folk guitar, and perhaps we can entice him next time to bring his didgeridoo, which is a native Australian Aboriginal instrument. David holds a Bachelor of Science degree from the University of Surrey in England. Please give a warm welcome to David Magellan Horth.
So when I first came to this country, I had to learn a few phrases. I had to make certain I'd got a basketball team I supported and all those kind of things. And I've been here almost 22 years now, and this is the closest approximation to my southern accent. Y'all come back now. Slightly, it's a northern version of the southern accent. You know, I'm living in Greensboro. When we start, one of the things that you'll find about me is I'm kind of a lazy guy. I found that when I first came to the Center for Creative Leadership, I was in training classes, and I thought training was all about lecturing. And after about 2 weeks, my tongue swelled up. My voice had gone completely. I couldn't sleep at night, and I realized I needed to slow down and actually, more importantly, get people engaged in doing stuff rather than me just lecturing at them. And so if you came here expecting me to lecture at you, then this is the wrong place for you. I'm going to make you work. Let's put it this way. I'm going to hopefully make you think or help you think about things. I've got 3 concepts that I'm sort of throwing at you, and they can go deeper, but I'm just kind of going to be scratching the surface of some of those as we go through this morning and trying to be honest and keep the hour. I may jump over a few of the slides I've got up here just to sort of honor the time that we have together. But I'm going to, from the outset, one of the ways I was reading the journal this morning, and it was the definition from Gerard Puccio about creative leadership. And one of the ways that Chuck Powless and myself, the co-author of the book, The Leader's Edge, defined leadership as a working definition while we were doing our research, was that creative leadership is about making shared sense of complexity. Making shared sense of complexity. And so I'm going to get into that definition right away. And so I want you to, you don't have to write anything down, but some of you may need to write something down. I want you to think of a difficult situation that you're involved in and you'd like to resolve. You're very invested in resolving it. And it's something that involves other people. You have to involve other people in this. And probably it's complex enough that we're going to have to think differently about resolving this. It could be a work thing. It could be something outside of, of the college. It's something that you're doing with a community or something like that. So the complexity, I'm going to define the complexity in these three ways for the time being. So, you know, no one seems to agree on where we're headed with this. That's the first thing that might make it complex. And then there's lots of bits and pieces that need to come together, so there's some coordination, and that's difficult in making it complex. And then you're the person who really is invested in making a difference, making something happen. But you wish everybody else was on the same page as you in terms of that emotional commitment. Now, when I asked you this question, something went through your internal radar. That's the one I want you to think about, right? It's that one. Don't deny it. That one that went through your internal radar is the one you... So, here's what I want you to do. On the floor in front of you, and of those of you, if you're sitting in a place where you didn't have something on the floor in front of you, there is either a blue-backed or a gray-backed postcard with an image on it. And you know, I can do it by you taking... If you like the image you've got, stick with it, or you might want to exchange it for another one near you. And I want you to connect that in some ways with that challenge that you've got. Now, human beings are really good at doing this metaphorical thinking. It's how we became human in the first place. We kind of make connections between things without really having to think about it. But somewhere in that image, or another one that you've thrown discarded and you picked another one, connects with that challenge, that difficult situation I asked you to look at. So, how does this image represent your challenge? And I want you to have a little conversation with the people on either side of you. So make certain there's more than two of you. Make certain there's at least three of you in this conversation. And what I want you to do is, you know, look at that image, share as much as you want to. You don't have to share all of the challenge, as much as you want to, of the challenge you're wrestling with and how it connects with this image. And then let the other people in your little group make interpretations. They look at the image and they can say, if this were my image, here's what I would see in that image, and here's the kind of connections I would make if that were my kind of challenge. And then do that with each of you. So try and make it there's no more than three of you in a group, but at least three of you in a group. And see what, I'm going to give you something like 7.5 minutes to do that. Go. So let's come together again. So what was it like? What was that conversation like? What was it like doing that? Anybody? I hear the word interesting. Insightful? Good.
We were amazed at how well the pictures fit our situation.
Isn't that interesting? Amazed at how the pictures fit the situation. And of course, that's this human capacity for making connections, even when you're forced to pick up the picture you've got, right? Any other thoughts about this?
It was enjoyable to get to see what other people are passionate about and have them explain it in their own words.
So interesting to see how what people were passionate about and how they could explain it in their own words. Good. Yeah?
I was surprised to see that my interpretation of the image for myself, what they had to say was really kind of reaffirming rather than just a different perspective.
Good. So from my interpretation of the image, other people were reaffirming of my own interpretation. Did anyone get something where somebody had like an opposite, you know, an opposite interpretation? Sometimes what will happen, you might get a negative interpretation, and somebody had a positive spin on it, and vice versa. I saw one with that, yeah, okay. So this is a little, you know, one of the things about this whole process is about having different kinds of conversations about important stuff. I mean, we should write a book called that sometime. And that's really what this tool is about. It's, you know, imagery is a way of getting people into those conversations. And the conversation you're having is being sort of focused on the image and not directly at each other. So we're not in a debate. We're trying to make sense of something collectively. And I'll get into that whole notion of making collective sense in a moment. So, I looked for an image that would go with Leadership Matters. I'll try to explain it in one image. There's a paper, I can get you electronic copies of it, that just came out that myself and a couple of other colleagues produced. around a whole new body of work called boundary-spanning leadership. And this is kind of our starting point, that there's so much going on in the world, and people being divided both, internally in countries and across borders of all kinds. And no one seems to want to agree anymore. Everyone just seems to want to, dissent and not agree just for the heck of it. And that seems to be happening all over the world. So there's in my sense of this, there's an absence of leadership, or an absence of effective leadership. And I'll get into that concept a little bit more in a moment. So I'm just going to sort of get into this notion of complexity and so on. This is a study that was done by IBM in 2010. And then in 2011, they did a follow-up study. And this next couple of slides say something like this. When they were asking CEOs of organizations right around the world, what is the thing that sort of has kept you afloat, in this poor economy? And what do you envisage is important to be dealing with the ongoing complexity of the world that you're working in and trying to do business in? And their answer was creativity, in fact, creative leadership. There's an interesting thing we diverge, IBM and ourselves diverge, and I've actually been in conversations with the researchers where they tend to define leadership in a very narrow way, and I'll explain that in a moment. So then they did another study in parallel, and they asked the senior HR people, the people who are responsible for developing the talent and management and leadership itself within organizations, how good are you at developing creative leaders? And they said, not very good. We suck at it, basically. So there's a whole body of other work they did. They did a follow-up study, and I was privileged to be interviewed as a subject for that follow-up study, which was what seems to make the difference. What is it that makes you a creative leader? And then they delved into that and said, how do we actually go about developing creative leaders? Of course, for IBM, it's all about how can we actually make more business by getting into this field. So one of the things I wanted to get at was this whole notion of, if innovation and creativity are important, how does that play out with, traditional business thinking? And so often, when we come out of business schools and so on, we're taught, not just from business schools, we're really good. The people I work with in corporations, by and large, are really good at the left-hand side. I'm not going to go break this whole thing down. But there's a notion that there's a different set of thinking skills, there's a different mindset associated with innovation that we also need to be involved in. And that in some ways, one of the ways of thinking about creative leadership is to manage the tension between traditional business and management thinking and the less conventional, innovative thinking. So we actually need to manage that tension. There are times that we need to sort of actually pay attention to the bottom line and do the left-hand side. But there are times where we need to be much more open-minded, much more, for want of a corny expression, sort of right-brain thinking is one of the things that people would characterize this as. There's one here that will probably, what the heck does that mean? See the second set? Deductive, inductive reasoning, abductive reasoning. Is anybody know what abductive reasoning is? It's kind of an interesting word. There's kind of two ways of looking at the notion of abductive reasoning. One of the ways of looking at it is you sort of envisage something out there in the future, and then you work backwards to figure out how you can get there. That's one way of thinking about abductive reasoning. Another way I like to think about it, it's kind of like, what does your gut tell you? It's kind of like you get the answer without actually not knowing exactly how you got there. It's sort of very closely, for me, also connected with this notion of intuition. So there's a gut feel about what the right answer is, but I haven't got the facts to prove it. So I kind of use that notion of it, and that's a lot of what happens. It also gets in this whole notion of emergence, that when we're trying to deal with a problem, it's so complex, we can't rationally think it through. We just have to take leaps of faith and leaps of intuition to get there. I'm going to do this by standing at the flip chart. This is from the work of Chuck Powless and myself, who wrote the book, The Leader's Edge. And we were working with teams of people, leadership teams in various organizations. and asking them, what were the challenges they were facing and how they were going about facing them. And we didn't do what you might call pure academic research. We would actually get in the trenches with them. We would actually go in there, roll our sleeves up and said, try this, try that, and so on. And what we found was that, that they were actually using what I would describe as artistic methods. And the set of competencies I'm going to talk about, we often describe them as neglected competencies. These are competencies we were born with, but somehow or other over time, through our education systems and so on, we've found them not to be relevant to our everyday living, to our everyday work, as it were. Except for the privileged few who tend to use these, people who are in the arts and so on, will tend to use these consciously, but they may not label these. And what we found is that they're neglected, but we need to actually reinvigorate them for the world that we're dealing with. We need to have these competencies available to us. The first of these competencies, this is what typically happens. We have a challenge, and because of this fabulous deductive reasoning that we have, we say, here's the answer, right? And we sometimes end up by screwing things up and making it worse than they were in the first place. There's so much complexity that we may have missed some nuances about the challenge we're wrestling with, and we end up screwing things up. I'm going to give you an example, just to sort of, it's just an example, and I'm not saying this is something we should eradicate from our business language or anything like that. But when people first thought about the notion of downsizing, and you as an organization has been through this very pain. The reason we're doing it is often associated with the bottom line. It's often associated, the thing that costs us most is employing people and all the overheads associated with that. So if we reduce the number of heads and try and find a way of being more effective in some ways, we're going to end up with a solution to this financial difficulty. Now that is an interesting, that seemed like a logical thing to do, but one of the things that people overlooked, and there's a lot of study done about this, is we don't reach the effectiveness that we thought we were going to because the people who are still working for us are demotivated and they're frightened to be creative because if they show up and if they stand out in the crowd, they may be the next person to lose their job. And so there's this whole pain associated with what's called survivor sickness. When people came out with this idea, they overlooked that issue. And that's one of the things that organizations have to deal with, how you actually deal with that survivor sickness. So there's this notion here of paying attention as the first thing, is really about looking down. There's a book out called Fast and Slow Thinking right now, which sort of plays into this, that sometimes we have to do that rapid moving forward thinking, but sometimes we have to be reflective. And the tool I gave you earlier on is about one of those ways of getting into slowing. This is why I usually say it this way. It's about slowing, looking down. So it's about really paying attention to it. I don't know if anybody experienced this when you were looking at the images, that you saw the image and you had a first interpretation of it, and then somebody else looked at the image and they saw things that you didn't see in the image in the first place. Did you get that? I see some heads nodding. It's that kind of thing. There are nuances in there that we didn't notice. So I describe this as a circuitous way of actually solving problems. It's a reflective way of addressing complex challenges. So we talk about this notion of paying attention. I believe this is the master competency. This is the one we really need to get first, above all else. We need to be reflective, even when there's urgency around. We need to be reflective and look at things in a nuanced way. The next of these competencies is personalizing. And personalizing is about bringing more of who we are to the work that we do. It's about, in the corporate world, for example, it's about not leaving who you are in the car park or, in the parking lot or at home and coming into work and being somebody else. I've had great examples of people who have dared to do something different around this. And so a friend of mine who is the CEO of an organization in Canada was trying to do something about how do I shake people up and how do I let people know who I am? how do I actually create a difference in the leadership in my organization? And it turns out that he is an accomplished amateur cellist. And so one day, he came into the management meeting, which he held sort of on a Monday morning typically, and he came in with his cello, and he played a piece for his leadership team, just to be vulnerable with them for a moment. And you know, it created a different kind of environment about what was possible and what people could do. It led to some other things around this. But there's this notion of bringing who you are. At a more practical level, I was coaching a guy from Sweden who was really quite, what's the word? Do you understand the term straight-laced? You understand that term? Very sort of, you know, stiff guy. And I asked him about things that he liked to do outside of the workplace. And one of the things he liked to do was he liked to work in the garden. He liked to grow carrots and potatoes and things like that. And this guy was a scientist, and out and out, he invented one of the world's top drugs that's around at the moment. And he had this as a passion. And there's a word passion is important. What am I passionate about over and above my work that I can bring into the work? And basically, he began to use stories of how he was working in the garden to communicate with people in a way that he hadn't been able to achieve before. And that was one of his problems, and how he actually communicated with people in a different way. So the notion of personalizing. The next one of these competencies is imaging. And this is about the use of metaphor. It's about anything but verbal, except poetry, of course. So it's about using poetry, imagery, metaphor, stories, and so on, to actually make sense of things. So what I did with you earlier on was right into this space, using images as a way of portraying and getting in touch with and understanding various things. And the next of these competencies is serious play. And the notion of serious play, and there's a book actually called Serious Play that actually came out at the same time as our book. And it's the notion of standing back from the seriousness of the situation and having some levity or, you know, fun in a different way. I mean, this plays out in all kinds of ways. It literally will play out as humor in some cases. But it may simply be, let's just take a stand back as a group. Let's go off somewhere and let our brains do their thinking in a different space. So actually standing away from the problem. You know how sometimes, here's one of my favorite places to play. I dream a lot, right? Has anyone ever woken up in the morning with a solution to a problem that they've been wrestling with? Has anyone? I see some, right? It's one of those places we didn't think we were going to do it, but somehow the dream did it for us. Well, there's ways of deliberately doing that, of course, and we hear about retreats and all those kind of things. Just going to a different space, not deliberately thinking about the problem, and then coming back to it and see what happens. So there's a notion of serious play. After this, we go into co-inquiry. And this is, I'm showing it as a sort of logical progress. It's not quite like that. It doesn't go this, then this, and this. They're all actually aspects of each other. They all overlap in some way. This notion of co-inquiry is a fancy way, collaborative inquiry is a fancy way of saying dialogue. Here's my favorite story about dialogue. Because there's this thing about, and I'm going to be talking about leadership in a moment, that we can get very confused about. And one of my favorite stories is I was in South Africa a few years ago. And I won't even get the word right. It may come to me in a minute. But I'm doing a presentation not too dissimilar from this with a group of business people going through a leadership class, and they just came to this class, and I was doing Visual Explorer with them, and I was giving them this lecture. And they at the end of this 1 hour presentation, they gave me a present, and I had no idea what the present was. It didn't rush out in the middle of it. I started the lecture by saying, if there's nothing else you get from my lecture, it's the notion of dialogue. And I'm still big on this, that the whole notion of dialogue is so central to effective leadership and collective sense-making. And at the end of this presentation, they gave me this book. And I said, shall I open it? And I opened it up, and the book was called, and I'm going to have to go back into my memory. You know, we have to you have to wait for the word to come in your mind, and it's not going to if you start thinking about it. Well, what the word meant was it simply meant dialogue. And it was a South African word for it, and here they were presenting me a book which spoke to that, and I'll try and remember the word. The reason this is important to me is one of the people we think of as a stunning example of a leader in the world is Nelson Mandela, right? You agree with me on that? But what people don't get, his biggest gift is dialogue. He was taught that by the family that adopted him. He was taught by a king who understood dialogue, basically, and he witnessed dialogue happening in which the king, as it were, brought people together in a circle who were arguing about some kind of issue to actually create a space where they can have a dialogue. And the dialogue typically started off by people actually saying nasty things about the king himself. And then they may or may not come to a conclusion. If they did, they would sort of fulfill that, or they would come together again at some point. But this is something that Nelson Mandela, it was key to the transformation in South Africa, where the gift he had to actually help people have dialogue, not just himself, but other people, and people who are very different from him. So this notion of dialogue is really central. The last thing is this whole notion of crafting. And crafting is about putting things together. It's another way of looking at this is it's all of these other competencies put together in some kind of gestalt. It's the ability to use these competencies in a way that play out and help us make sense collectively of the challenges of wrestling. And this leads to, I'm going to use the word here, robust solutions. Solutions that are sustainable. People are buying into them. We've had a deeper look into things and so on. Is this making sense to you? This is a body of so this is one set of competencies that oh, my clicker's over here. One of the things you have to learn about when you're doing a lot of presentations is, where the heck did I put my clicker? So I want to get into leadership a moment. Close to you somewhere, and probably one between two of you, is a red back card with an image on it and a phrase. And the intention is that you use the phrase as well, but the image may be enough for you. And I want you to think about the leadership in this organization called BSC, right? I'm going to challenge you to think about leadership. And I think about it as in a collective way. You're not thinking about an individual, you're thinking about collectively, and I'll get into that a bit more. And so, the image you've got, does it describe how things were in the past? Does it describe us when we're at our worst? Does it describe how it looks like now? Does it describe what we look like when we're at our best? Does it describe how we need to look like in the future? Or it might even describe how it needs to look like to resolve the major challenges we face. So what I want you to do is have a conversation in pairs or wherever you need of the card you've got, and what does that card you've got speak to? One of those questions. Go. Give you 5 minutes for that. Does anybody want to share the card they've got and the sense they made of it relative to any of these questions? Not getting any. Oh.
So the one I have is nurturing parents.
Nurturing parents, right?
And for me, it's BSC currently and also at its best form.
Okay.
That even in the worst of times, the faculty and staff will step up to the plate and nurture us because they don't want us to fight over the same word, but just kind of send us off into our new directions. I'm a senior, so that's probably my interpretation of it.
Right, that's good. So nurturing parents for us at our best of times and now. And, leaders stepping in and nurturing us, right? And not letting us fight over one worm. I think that's one of the things you put in there. Good. Any others? Any others that came to? There's some code built into this, by the way. I think I've told you this. You use this one. You'll notice that some of the cards have got different colored lettering on it. It's kind of talking about stages of leadership development, which I can get into in a discussion outside of here as well. But you'll find that they kind of represent something. Again, this is about trying to get people to have conversations about leadership. I often use this with people who have never thought about leadership before as a way of getting them started thinking about what does leadership mean to you? What what do the best leaders look like, or those kind of things, getting people having conversations about leadership. So that's what that tool's about. And I just did that. Oh, by the way, I've got to tell you this. When the guy who created this for me is a friend of mine now. I'd seen him doing some fabulous work, and I said, I need to create a set of cards, and I'm going to give you the words, and you have to draw the pictures for them. And you see the one that says co-creating musicians? Right? He got it wrong the first time. I had to send him back to the drawing board. I said, it has to look like the Beatles. Sorry. So let me just talk about this leadership. Alan had me talking about this with a group this morning. Tell you a bit of a story about this first. Some years ago, we had a president who was very much somebody who wanted things sort of like just so. He was a former three-star general. And he was determined that we had a consistent definition of leadership in the organization. Because you'd go through one of our programs and every trainer had their favorite definition of leadership. And you'd go through all kinds of books and you'd see all kinds of definitions. He said, we are the preeminent Center for Creative Leadership, and we do all this research. We should have one definition of leadership. And two of my colleagues wrote a report in which they created a meta-definition of leadership in which all definitions fit. And the report they wrote was, it's long-winded, it's making common sense, leadership as meaning-making in a community of practice. It's a long phrase. What they were suggesting here is that leadership is a social process, or you saying this word process, right? It's a process, right? It is not a person. And one of the things we confuse when we're studying leadership, we tend to look at great leaders. We look at Nelson Mandela's and so on, and we tend to invest that as being leadership. Well, leadership is a process, not a person. It's a gerund describing a process. And so, several years later, one of my other colleagues, and these first two people basically, were thinking about, well, if it's a process, then if, where I'm from, a process has to have inputs and outputs. And so what is the output of leadership? What's the outcome of the process of leadership? The outcome of the process of leadership are these three things. I haven't, and I've actually sort of stated it in it's almost in a process way, but it's shared direction, shared alignment, shared commitment. Without these three things, we do not have leadership happening. And the important thing is that we're all part of this process. If a small group of people say we're going in that way and other people are looking in the other direction, leadership is not happening. We all contribute to it. The leadership is not the responsibility of the leaders, it's the responsibility of everybody. They may have a significant role if you're sitting it hierarchically in an organization. You may have a role to set up leadership processes and so on, and you may have a louder voice, but at the end of the day, if everybody's not following you, then leadership is not happening. And so there's this notion here about, when I asked you to think about the challenge right at the beginning of this presentation, you remember I use those phrases, we don't seem to know where we're going, and it's difficult to pull the work together, and then there's this notion of, I wish people were as invested as I am. I was asking you to define that challenge in terms of direction, alignment, commitment. So that's why I was getting you to do that little exercise. I just said this basically. While it might fall on a small group of people, we're all involved, and all three dimensions must be present. So let me just. I'm a great believer in Venn diagrams. This may be a little bit boring, but it's a way of portraying this concept that I find very useful. So if you imagine this notion of shared direction, alignment, commitment, and I've already done the sweet spot in the middle. That's leadership, right? So that's the hardest one to solve on a Venn diagram. So we've solved it. Now, what happens if we've got direction and alignment, but no commitment or low commitment? This is what it looks like. We're coordinated and facing the same way, but there's no momentum. There's no passion. There's no energy to make things move, right? And so nobody walks the talk, and only the easy things get done. So there's no real progress. In fact, all of these things actually have a line failure to progress. So imagine that we've got direction and commitment, but we lack alignment. This is what I call buy-in but uncoordinated. We're all buying into it, but we're uncoordinated. We don't know how to put the pieces together. So we end up competing for resources. And the deadlines, we don't get deadlines, we don't know how to work together, right? So those again, we have failed to progress effectively. So imagine you've got commitment and alignment, but a lack of direction. I liken this to, you can move now, there you go. I liken to this, we're all sitting in a bar together having a beer, right? And once we've drunk our beers, we all go off in different directions, right? There's no real purpose for us being together other than having a beer, right? And so there's this notion that we need some direction that kind of unites us and brings us together, with the other factors involved as well. So there's this notion of inertia, running around in circles, and teams going nowhere very fast. Right? So this is about the, lacking the direction, but having the energy and the alignment. We like being in the bar. So I'm going to use this little exercise as, and I want you to try and do this in pairs so I can do it a little quicker. I've given you two concepts so far, and try to dig as quickly as I can into them. One of them was around the sense-making loop and the notion of creative leadership in that sense. And the second one was around this notion of leadership as direction, alignment, commitment. And now what I'm going to get into is a body of work that has come out fairly recently, which I've been heavily involved in, called Boundary Spanning Leadership. And the reason I'm asking this question is that I pushed the author of this work, the researcher of this work, and I said, in your research, if you think about people who are really good at this, what is it they do or have that makes them stand out as being really good at this boundary spanning? What is it they do or are in some way? What is it about them? And after I pushed him hard and hard, he said, he gave me this question to ask, something about reaching out. So I'm going to ask you to think about a time. Now, this can be any time in your life, right? It could be fairly recently. But you've basically had to step out of the comfort of your own inner circle, your own family, your own working team, and so on. And you've reached out to people who are in some way different from you or do different work from you. And you learn something as a result of that. You learn something. Again, remember me that earlier on I said, what went through your internal radar, that's the one I want, that's the one I want. So think about that for a moment. And we've all experienced this. If we're older, in the age of reason, we've certainly experienced actually reaching out or being involved with people who are not exactly like us. So what I want you to do is turn to a partner and just quickly share your story. Just quickly share your story about reaching out. I'm not going to ask you to share any of these stories out loud with each other, but I'm going to ask you to just try and develop a simile or a metaphor for what that was like. And here's a way of getting into it, right? Reaching out to such and such a group or such and such a person was like. I'll give you some examples that I've heard in the past, right? Reaching out to, actually I'll give you a personal story. I'll help you with this one. So here's one of my reaching out stories. When I was in the computer business many years ago, I was an engineer who wielded a soldering iron and studied logic diagrams all day. And a new group of people moved into the department next door that were all programmers and software developers. And they were really, this is going to age me, you'll hear something that you won't believe. But I couldn't believe, first of all, how they dressed. I used to wear a tie. These people wore jeans and really scruffy stuff. And the other thing was, I noticed that they seemed to be reading newspapers a lot. They seemed to have their feet up on the desk reading newspapers a lot. Oh, this is a nice job. Here's me sweating over logic diagrams, and there people are. So one day I reached out to them to find out what the heck was going on. So this is where the aging comes in. So what it was they were doing, they had actually written a program or written bits of code. They'd gone down to a machine downstairs and they'd actually typed it onto punch cards. This is how old I am. Right? And then they'd stuff those into the hopper. And what was happening was the computer, which now carry something more powerful than that, like this thing is more powerful than that computer by a long way, basically was crunching the numbers, and it was doing something called consolidation. which often would take 6 hours. And there's nothing they could do except sit there and read newspapers until it all came out the other end. So I learned something about them, and it was one of the things that took me on a journey eventually into... so when I come to talk about what was it like reaching out to these people, it was like reaching out to a bunch of clowns. That's how I thought of it. It turned into something else, actually. It was, I can use all kinds of metaphors about how it turned out. But think of turn to your neighbor and see if you can come up with between you what it was like, you know, that assimilated. What was it like reaching out to people who were different than you in some way? You got some? Anyone got an inspiration right off the...
Running in mud.
Like running in mud, good. Yeah. Any others?
Reaching out to aliens who ended up being very loving.
Ah, reaching out to aliens who ended up by being very loving. That's often a story, isn't it? Running through a minefield, yes. What's the right thing to do? Yes. That's a good one for when I came to this country. I had to mind my P's and Q's quite a lot. One of my favorites I heard was, you know, in the business world was reaching out, and he talked about reaching out to another group was like getting a free consultant. It's kind of interesting. But we've often got these positive stories of what reaching out feels like good. So this body of work comes from 10 years of study. It was called the Leading Across Differences study. And it involved interviews on all 5 continents. And we have a program called Leadership at the Peak, where you're invites only. They're basically for CEOs of corporate companies. And we asked them about, you know, what was important in terms of the competencies they and others needed in the organization. What were the leadership competencies that stand out? And they came up with this. I'm going to go straight into the next part of it. That basically they believed this whole notion of reaching across and collaborating across boundaries was the #1 competency that they need to be targeted at. And when they were asked about how good are you doing at it, how good is the organization at doing it, there was a 79% gap. It was like a frighteningly big gap between what they believed was important and what their own and other people's abilities was like. And so the reason I was giving that whole thing about direction, alignment, commitment, I just talked about direction, alignment, commitment, and we may be in a leadership situation where we're in an inner circle, we've got a group of team we're working with. But leadership across boundaries is about how do you create direction, alignment, commitment across those boundaries with people that we don't have, you know, we don't have reporting structures for. How do we reach out between different disciplines? I was working with USGS, US Geological Survey, and some of their top leaders earlier this year. Well, actually, yeah, it was earlier this year. And I'd been working with them for about a year, and basically what happened was, you know, the US Geological Survey was founded by Lewis and Clark. Do you know that? They actually founded that organization. And the structures that were in place and the disciplines that were in place were the same disciplines going way back. And they all worked in silos. They all, you know, they had different, there are amazingly different sciences associated with studying the Earth, right? And they all had these different disciplines. And the person who called me in is a friend that I'd met actually going through a program 20 years ago. She had this job of bringing together some of the scientists so that they were addressing topical issues, so that you don't have different disciplines. You're actually in one unit and you've got the scientists in the room who could do it. And one of the most interesting challenges I've ever seen is this. She has one group that they provide services for people looking at environmental issues, the green issues. You know, you might, and she said some people call that group the tree huggers, right? So there's one group that's looking at that. The other group working for her is looking at natural resources. So she's providing services for people who are doing gas and oil exploration. And she's got those sets of scientists in 2 different groups. So her challenge was, how do I actually create leadership across that? It's not easy, and there's a whole beautiful story that's been emerging out of that, about how they started beginning to realize you have to actually figure out how you measure the unmeasurable. You have to be able to figure out how you measure the loss of a landscape. It's kind of an interesting thing. So the boundaries that come out of this research are categorized like this. vertical, horizontal. When we looked at the research, by the way, the one that was the hardest to span and the one that typically comes up in organizations when you ask them which is the one that you're worst at, it's the horizontal one. It's, getting over the stovepipes. It's, working with other disciplines. That's the one that tends to be. Stakeholders about working with people outside of the organization, vendors and so on. The demographic speaks for itself. And often the demographic and geographic are mixed together. In the organization I work out, it plays out big time. I'm not going to go into this because I want to honor your time. Imagine you had 3 strategies for dealing with and creating leadership across boundaries. And these are the 3 strategies: managing boundaries, forging common ground, and discovering new frontiers. Where would you start? Which of those would you start? There is a right answer. I'm sorry if I'm playing tricks on you. There is a right answer. For me, there's a right answer. Where would you start? Sorry? And this is where we tend to head. After all, if we can just sit them in the room together, and we'll be able to get moved forward. It's actually the wrong move from a leadership perspective. It's counterintuitive that you actually start with managing boundaries. So the place to start that we often get, I've seen it in all kind of walks of life, in business and in the social sphere, we tend to bring people together, and we don't spend enough time honoring who they are differently. Do you get that? Yep. People need to be safe in their own skin and their own identity first. And if we can get that, then we can start moving forward and bring them together. So there's a whole process around this that we start from managing boundaries. Under each of those strategies is a series of practices. I'm actually involved in one in Greensboro. I'm facilitating a group that's looking at putting on or creating a performing arts center in Greensboro. And it's absolutely loaded with the boundaries, for political and each which way, and this amazing set of boundaries. But the first thing is about buffering. And buffering is about creating safety. So when people are safe in their own identity, they know what their identity is. And then we move to a place where we start appreciating who we are and now how we're different from other people. So there's this notion of respect that we're trying to create. We then move to this one, which I believe is a really hard one. And I'm going to give you a little tip on this one just because it's I found it sort of so important. The whole notion of creating trust. And, in organizations, we fail to do this correctly. Because connecting is about connecting as human beings, not as co-workers or potential co-workers. It's about breaking bread together, those kind of things. Do you understand what I'm getting at? It's really understanding people at a human level. That's going to make the difference, which is the thing that creates trust. I talked about Nelson Mandela. If you read any of the stories and you've seen any of the films around what happened in the transformation of South Africa, there was an awful lot of stuff that was focused around people just taking a walk together, talking about anything, talking about their families, those kind of things that actually was part of the process of getting trust between people who were very different, had very different agendas. Mobilizing is about creating community, and that's often done by doing work together that's that actually is pretty easy to see and do, and then moving towards creating interdependence, and then finally, the reason why we try to bring people together in the first place is to create something new, to transform and discover new frontiers in some ways. I've got 1 minute. What should I do?
Well, how about...
You want to do that? Okay, I'll do that. I'm going to assume you're okay not asking questions, but I'm around all day if somebody would grab me, and there are other forums that are going to be around. One of the things I handed out was a Wisdom Explorer card. Does anyone want to read out one of those quotes that would serve as a way of closing for us that seems to, in some ways, capture what we've been playing with in the terms of the concepts today? Has anyone got one that just sort of stood out for them for one reason or another, the quote they've got they really like and they want to read it out? Go on.
I looked at all 3 of ours and I like this one the best. Where there is no vision, people perish.
Where there is no vision, people perish. Good. Who was the author of that quote?
It's Proverbs 29:18.
Oh, some Proverbs. Yes, of course. Yeah, good. Where there is no vision, people perish. Any others that we've got? So we're talking about leadership here. That's the direction element, right? Any others?
The greatest strength is gentleness.
The greatest strength is gentleness. Lovely.
It takes boldness to invest in initiatives of uncertain potentialities, but is out of such support that some of the greatest discoveries have been made.
That was H. Smith Richardson, wasn't it? He was the founder of the center. Yeah. Takes boldness. Any others?
Nothing is more capable of troubling our reason and consuming our health than secret notions of jealousy and solitude.
That speaks to the boundary spanning stuff, doesn't it? It's lovely. I know all of these quotes, but I don't remember them by heart.
Do we get to keep these?
If anybody wants to hang on to the cards they got, please do so, yeah.
One says, to hold the same views at 40 as we held at 20 is to have been stupefied for a score of years and take rank not as a prophet, but as an unteachable brat, well birched and none the wiser.
It's funny how we go around in circles and keep learning the same lesson, isn't it? Any final ones? Thank you all for your time here. I want to honor the time that we spent together, and I'm going to be around for the day if people might be bumping into me again and can ask me different questions. I'm having lunch with a group of people right now as well. So thanks very much for being here.